שבאתם. יש לנו גם סטודנטים ישראלים וגם סטודנטים אמריקאים. Who's American here? Okay. אז קצת בעברית ואז אני אמשיך באנגלית. I'll do a little in Hebrew and then I'll continue in English. אני מאוד מודה לכם שהזמנתם אותי לנאום פה ביום אמריקה, פה באוניברסיטת חיפה. אני הסתובבתי בכל העיר כל היום עם ראש העיר, בכמה חברות, במדע טק, בעוד כמה מקומות בעיר הנפלאה הזאת, שבאמת דוגמה מצוינת של דו-קיום וסובלנות במדינת ישראל. ואני מאוד שמח על ההזדמנות לבוא לדבר על השותפות שלנו, גם עם עיירת חיפה וגם עם מדינת ישראל, שותפות בתחום הביטחון, ואני אדבר על המאמץ שלנו יחד עם מדינת ישראל למנוע מאיראן לקבל נשק גרעיני. אני אדבר גם על יחסים בינינו ומחויבות של ארצות הברית לעזור לישראל להיות מדינה בטוחה, חזקה, יהודית, דמוקרטית. ואז אני אשמח להיכנס לדו-שיח, לשיחה איתכם ולקבל כמה שאלות. So I'll switch to English now. And thank you all for coming and for the remarkable reception that I saw out the side with all the American flags and the red, white, and blue balloons. It felt like home. And it was a great thing to see because I thought it symbolized the friendship and partnership between our countries. Being the ambassador to Israel is a great job. The American ambassador to Israel is a great job because I think for the most part, and I think probably most people in this audience would agree, people in Israel really want to feel a connection to the United States. We want to feel it too, but I get to be the representative who experiences that strong sense of connection that Israelis are seeking. I want to thank, in his absence, the mayor, Yonah Yahav, who welcomed me in his office earlier today, and his staff, and we have a member of the city council here, Eli, who's also been with me. I want to thank President Ben Zeev and the university administration also for welcoming me, and we've had a wonderful chance to talk with some of the faculty here, particularly those who are studying things related to our relationship. I want to just talk for just a few minutes about the job I'm doing here. The job I'm doing here, as I was assigned to it by President Obama and Secretary of State Clinton, was to come to Israel, where we already have one of the strongest, richest, deepest, most mutually beneficial relationships of any diplomatic relationship we have in the world, and try to make it even better, try to make it even stronger, try to make it even richer, try to make it even deeper. And so it's a job that entails both coordination between our governments, which is very good. In my previous job, I worked at the White House on the National Security Council on the Middle East desk and was a key participant in all of the discussions between the President and the Prime Minister and all the other high-level members of both of our governments. And so I continue to do that role today. That's an important role for any ambassador to participate in the diplomatic communication between the governments. But the other major function that an ambassador can play, and nowadays in the modern world of instant communications and social media, is to be an ambassador to the people of the country as well as to the government. So I've really made it a priority to travel throughout Israel as often as possible outside of Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, which are great cities and where the centers of government and business are located, but not where everybody lives. And there are so many other parts of Israel, so many interesting and vibrant and dynamic communities, so many, I think, parts of the Israeli society who may seek a desire, a connection with Israel, but may not have as many, with the United States, but may not have as many natural opportunities or as much history that connects them to us. So that's why I come to places like Haifa. That's why I go to places like Arad and Beit Sha'an and Kiryat Gat and Bnei Brak, places that may not be used to seeing an American ambassador, but it's as important to talk to them as it is to talk to the leadership of the government and try to not only educate them about the American perspective on this relationship and the issues we work on together, but also to hear and learn about the Israeli perspective on those same issues and make sure our government is properly educated about that perspective. So I've also made it a point to visit all of the universities in Israel in the first several months I've been here, and Haifa University was high on my list, and there's nothing like coming to this beautiful city, enjoying the fantastic views, the wonderful spirit of tolerance and coexistence that is so present in the city and at the university. And I've enjoyed this day traveling around the city so much, and I very much look forward to returning. I thought I'd spend a few minutes just talking about the big issues that we work on, and then open it up for a conversation with all of you. The United States starts from a proposition, and therefore my main responsibility is to further a relationship of strength, of trust, of mutual benefit. And we do it both because we have a moral commitment to Israel, but also we do it because it's in our strategic interests. And it's in our interest that Israel, which has been such a good ally, the best ally we have in this part of the world, the best security partner we have, and I'll say more about that, that it continue to be the same strong Jewish democratic state, secure country that it has been. And that's why our commitment is so strong, because that benefits us, that benefits the United States. So it takes many forms. One of the most important forms it takes is the incredible security cooperation between our governments. Just tonight, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Martin Dempsey, the head, our Ramatkal, will be arriving for a visit, meeting with Ramatkal Benny Gantz, with the Prime Minister, with the Defense Minister. These are regular consultations that go on between the highest level of our militaries. There are close personal friendships. There's a great deal of very detailed sharing of ideas, thinking, analysis about what's happening in this region, about what Israel's security needs are, about how we, the United States, can help guarantee Israel's qualitative military edge. And so this visit is just one example in a long, long string of such visits and communications. You all know that the United States has, for many, many years, provided a very significant military assistance package to Israel. It's now about $3 billion a year. Again, we do that because a strong Israel is in our interest and because of our commitment to ensure Israel's ability to defend itself from any threat that it faces. There are a number of areas where we've really focused and have made real significant contributions in the area of joint technological development, military technologies. And the most significant in many ways, the ones that certainly get the most attention, are the missile defense systems, where the United States has for 3 decades supported the Arrow missile defense system, which will protect Israel from long-range missile defense. We're currently developing with Israel the David Sling system, which will be a mid-range missile defense system. And of course, you all know about the Iron Dome system, Kipat Barzel, which was a major focus of my work at the White House. It followed President Obama's visit to Israel in 2008 when he was a candidate for office, and he went to Sderot and he saw homes that had been destroyed by missiles from Gaza, and he met families who had experienced that trauma, and he made a commitment that whatever we could do to help Israel deal with that very real and real-time threat, not something that might happen in the future, which we also have to work on, but a real threat that Israelis have dealt with for the last decade of thousands and thousands of missiles being fired at them, we would do, and we would do it as fast as we could. So when he took office, he asked that we accelerate our support for development and production of the Iron Dome system, and asked for extra money, $200 million above the annual military assistance package. The Congress provided it, and now we are helping produce 4 additional Iron Dome missile batteries. I had the opportunity to visit one that was deployed near Ashkelon. I had the opportunity to travel to the Rafael factory not far from here and see the production of these missiles that U.S. taxpayers are paying for, and something that we feel very strongly is a very good investment in helping defend Israelis, really save lives with a technology that Israelis have developed, but we can help fund. So these are just a few examples. There's a lot of joint training that goes on between our militaries. There's a lot of incredibly deep intelligence sharing on Iran, on Syria, on Hamas, on Hezbollah, on all the threats that we both face in this region. And we're very proud of that and committed to deepening and continuing that. We also know that Israel is living in a very dangerous region. And there are a lot of very profound threats that Israel faces, many of which we also face, and uncertainties. The biggest threat, of course, is Iran, and the prospect that Iran could acquire a nuclear weapon, which we believe is the goal of their nuclear program, or at least the burden is on them to prove otherwise. And therefore, we have, together with Israel and with many partners in Europe and in the Gulf and in Asia, have imposed the strongest sanctions that Iran has ever experienced to put economic pressure on Iran to prevent it, to convince the Iranian leadership that it's too costly to pursue a nuclear weapon. The sanctions began, well, they didn't begin, but they took the first big step up in June of 2010 with the UN Security Council Resolution 1929 that the United States led. We added additional sanctions just from the United States and coordinated those with Europe and with some countries in the Gulf to add additional sanctions of their own. And then most recently, a new law was passed in the Congress. The President signed it on December 31st, which would apply sanctions against the Central Bank of Iran and companies in other countries that do business with the Central Bank, and give us strong tools to convince other countries to reduce and hopefully end their purchases of Iranian oil. Because if we are able to deprive Iran of the revenue that it gets from its oil sales, that would be the biggest blow to its economy. And already, in the 3 weeks since that law was signed, we've used that tool very effectively, I think, to focus the minds of European governments, of Asian governments, of others, that the threat of sanctions right now, even though we haven't imposed them yet, is a good reason to change their behavior, a good reason to stop or reduce their purchases of Iranian oil, to find other sources of oil, and we're working with the Saudis and others to try to make sure there's enough replaced supply for what Iran would no longer be supplying, and to get their banks to stop doing business and doing transactions with the Central Bank of Iran. And in just those 3 weeks, we've seen the Iranian currency be devalued. We've seen the Iranian political behavior shaken and made a little more erratic. I think Prime Minister Netanyahu described it as a wobble, which is a good description. That while it hasn't changed their focus on their nuclear program yet, we believe it's adding new levels of pressure that they have yet to face and are really going to, we hope, force them to deal with that choice that we've put before them. Now, we know that may or may not work, and that's why we're also making sure we have every other option available. And the President has been very clear that every option is on the table, and he's considering all his options, and he's directed our military and our Secretary of Defense to ensure that the necessary planning and the necessary preparations are done so that those options are actually ready and available at any time the President might choose to exercise them. But it's out of an absolute conviction that Iran acquiring a nuclear weapon is a threat to Israel and to the United States and to other allies and our forces in the region that we really can't allow to materialize. We also know Israel is living in a very dynamic region in the Middle East with transitions going on in the Arab world that are truly historic and truly unprecedented and very unpredictable. We don't really know what will emerge in Egypt, in Syria, in Libya, in any of these neighbors. And of course, Israelis are very understandably concerned that an environment that had at least become predictable and at least was known, who you were dealing with in Egypt and Syria and elsewhere, is changing, and we don't know what lies on the other side of that. We also know that we won't control the outcomes, just as the United States did not control the departure of Mubarak from Egypt. That was something the Egyptian people controlled. We will not control who rules Egypt. The Egyptian people control that as well. The same is true in Syria, and the same is true in Libya and Tunisia. What we can do is, number one, establish some very clear principles about what we will insist upon of the governments that succeed the outgoing governments. We believe every people, the Egyptian people and the Syrian people and every other people, has a right to live in a society governed by a democratic, transparent government that is responsive to the legitimate aspirations of their people, that respects the rights of their people, the rights of freedom of speech and religion and assembly, that respects the rights of women and religious and ethnic minorities, and that is a responsible international actor. And that means keeping international commitments. Certainly in the case of Egypt, that means abiding in full by the treaty with Israel. And we have made very clear to everybody in Egypt, the military, the political parties, both the old ones and the new ones, and people throughout Egyptian society, that that is our expectation of what must emerge from this transition in Egypt. And our own relationship with Egypt will very much depend on it. We do have leverage, we have a relationship, we have assistance we provide. Most Egyptians of all political backgrounds want very much to retain that relationship with the United States. And so that gives us not controlling, an ability to control the outcome in Egypt, but certainly an ability to try to influence it and steer it and channel it in a positive direction. I think Israel has made its own contribution by maintaining a very strong and effective channel of communication between the Israeli military and the Egyptian military, and we obviously give Israel credit for doing so in an environment in which there is uncertainty and there's risk. That's basically the attitude we have about all of these changes in the Arab world. There's risk that these revolutions, as other revolutions in history have been, could be hijacked by extremists and taken in a very dangerous direction. And there's risk that treaties that have been relied upon could be torn up. That risk is real, and we need to stand with Israel and ensure that it can deal with that risk. But we also can take steps, as I described, to try to minimize it. The other side of the equation is there's real opportunity in these changes. These are not changes in the Arab world that are going to take place over months. They're going to take place over years. And we don't know from month to month what's going to happen. We know we'll hear some voices from certain extreme organizations that we don't like and that make us uncomfortable. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that's how they will govern if they come to power. It doesn't necessarily mean that if they come to power, they can sustain power. These are transitions that are going to take place over a period of years. And if at the end of that process, Israel can experience something that it never has experienced, which is democratic neighbors, that would actually be a real strategic boon, a real benefit. Israel never has had democratic neighbors, and we know in history democratic neighbors generally don't fight wars against each other, and they generally behave responsibly toward each other. That's something that we hope we can get to. We can't guarantee it, but we are going to work as best we can using the influence we do have to try to channel things in that direction, with our eyes fully open to the risk. The other thing that we, of course, remain focused on, because it's very much part of our commitment to help Israel survive and thrive as a Jewish democratic state, is working to achieve a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Every Israeli government since the late 1990s has established that as their goal, and I think out of a clear understanding that that is a requirement for Israel's future as a secure Jewish democratic state, something we, of course, agree with. It's the way Israel can achieve its aspirations. It's the way Palestinians can achieve their aspirations for self-determination in a state of their own. But it can only be done through direct negotiations. And so we have opposed unilateral measures by the Palestinians to go to the United Nations. We have opposed efforts to delegitimize Israel in those institutions. And we've insisted that the only place this conflict can be resolved is in direct negotiations between the two parties. We have good partners in the quartet, the United States, Russia, the European Union, and the United Nations, who have established a framework for those talks to begin again after a long period of time in which there were no talks. We've had a very positive initiative by the government of Jordan to bring the two parties together for the first direct talks since September of 2010. And so we've now had 3 meetings between the Israeli and Palestinian negotiators. There's another one scheduled. And what we hope is that those meetings can lay the groundwork with perhaps some gestures each side can make toward the other that will improve the atmosphere and increase the level of confidence and trust in one another, which is very low, and use that as a basis to begin having the conversations on the core issues, on territory, on security, ultimately on Jerusalem and refugees that must be resolved at the negotiating table, but also must be resolved in order to help both sides achieve their goals of a two-state solution. So that remains very much one of our commitments, part of our commitment to Israel's future. Finally, I would just say that it's a fact, and I think it's a fact that we feel very happy about, that the relationship between the United States and Israel is not only at the level of our governments. The relationship at the level of the governments is very good. And the coordination between the Prime Minister and the President, who just spoke on the phone last week, and their teams, and our militaries, and our intelligence services, and all levels of our government is really extraordinary. It's unlike almost any relationship we have in the world. But it's also the case that we have an incredibly rich connection between the peoples of our countries, the peoples of two democracies, who share a lot of history, who share common values. How many people here have spent time in the United States? Almost everybody. And if you haven't, I'm sure you're standing at our consular table to try to figure out how you can get to the United States. That's a good thing. We have a lot of Americans who come to Israel for study, for business, for cultural exchange, out of a religious affinity, whether it's Jewish or Christian or Muslim. And what we want to do is we want to deepen those ties all the time. That's why I'm here at a university and encouraging all of you to find ways to spend time in the United States, and I'm going to have give the same encouragement to American students who come through, that they come and spend time here. That's why we are very excited about the opportunities in the economic sphere, especially, and I'm thinking of this particularly in Haifa, in the high-tech field, where so many American companies have discovered that the Israeli talent pool is a great place to base their research and development operations. And so many Israeli and American academics and scientists are collaborating on development of new products and new technologies. I think we've only scratched the surface of what's possible in that realm, and I think it's very exciting to think that the economic dimension of our relationship can grow to be as important as the security dimension or as the democratic values dimension of our relationship. And I also think it's true that our societies, both of our societies, are changing. They're dynamic. And the Israel of today will look very different in 15 or 20 years as certain communities grow. The Haredi community grows, and the national religious, and the Russian, and the Arab sector, and the Ethiopian sector are growing and are in many ways becoming more influential over time. Perhaps those communities don't know the United States as well as other Israelis do, and perhaps we don't know them as well as we should. So an important part of our job in our embassy is to go out into those communities, get to know them, help them get to know us. And the same is true in the United States, where there are emerging communities who also may not have the same historical and religious and other kind of connections with Israel. I want all of those communities to find Israelis that they can be partners with and discover why Israel is such a valuable ally. I want the relationship between our countries to be even stronger 15 or 20 years from now than it is today. Obviously, I won't be ambassador then, but hopefully during the time I'm here, we can lay some of the groundwork to broaden and deepen those ties into parts of our society that maybe have not fully experienced them. And I consider all of you partners in that effort as well. So again, I'll close just by thanking the University of Haifa and all the hosts in the municipality and among the students here for your hospitality today. It's an honor to share America Day with you, and thank you very much. Well, I've had the honor to work alongside President Obama for about 5 years now, first in his campaign and then in the White House and now here. And I think it's the opposite is true, that in fact the relationship between the United States and Israel has only gotten closer and has only gotten stronger during the time that he's been in office. And I think the people I rely on to make that judgment are the military leaders of both countries who say they've never experienced coordination and security cooperation as close and as at high a level as they have now. That doesn't happen by accident. That happens when leaders like President Obama and Prime Minister Netanyahu make a policy decision that whatever disagreements we might have, and we do have them, we are close friends, but that doesn't mean we agree on everything. And it's natural that friends can disagree. That even while that happens, we will strengthen and deepen our connections, particularly in the security area, but in other areas as well. And I mentioned economics, and I mentioned cultural connections as well. I think there have been some very profound examples recently of the strong support from the president. He gave a speech at the United Nations in September, which made very clear that the United States is going to stand with Israel against international delegitimization and is going to reject taking the Palestinian issue to the United Nations when it belongs at the negotiating table between the two parties. And I think I heard a very positive response about that speech from many Israelis. A few days before that happened, the president was on the phone in the middle of the night to General Tantawi in Egypt to try to help save the lives of Israelis trapped inside the embassy in Cairo. A lot of people in our government, myself included, worked through the night to support Israel in that effort. Fortunately, it worked out. And I think, again, it's the kind of example of the way friends support each other in a time of crisis. So I think the support is as good as it's ever been. On the issue of Jerusalem, there's really no change in U.S. policy over the last 43 years. The U.S. policy is that Jerusalem is a final status issue that needs to be negotiated by the parties. Its status has not yet been determined and can only be determined in negotiations. In fact, the parties themselves have agreed that Jerusalem is one of the issues that needs to be negotiated. And so we discourage any side from taking unilateral steps that might make those negotiations harder or prejudice their outcome. But that's been a consistent policy for 40 years. Well, there's a difference, of course. In Egypt, those issues are indeed being debated, and there are people in some segments of the Egyptian political world who express views that might be concerning to us about religious freedom or women's rights, but they don't yet have all of the democratic institutions in place to really resolve those issues, or that we know how they'll be resolved, or the process by which they'll be resolved. They're starting. They've had what appear to be free and fair elections for a parliament. Now they're going to write a new constitution. They will, we hope, have a free election for a president. We hope that those institutions will develop and that those rights will be respected. And again, we won't be able to control it, but we will be able to try to use our influence to steer them in that direction. Israel's a different situation because, first of all, it's a very vibrant democracy, and it has been since its founding. The debate that goes on this campus and in the newspapers and in the Knesset is the best evidence of the kind of democracy it is, where everybody can lend its voice. And there are clear legal protections and institutional foundations for the rights of women and the rights of minorities. We have a lot of confidence in Israeli democracy and Israeli society and Israeli institutions to deal with these problems or these as they come up. There are divisions within the society. I think that's clear. But there's also a framework, a democratic institutional framework of a Knesset and courts and a free media that I think are a very solid foundation to achieve them. When the issue of Hadarat Nashim arose in the last weeks and months, the condemnation about efforts to exclude women was across the political spectrum. It was from every party, every leader, every faction in the Knesset, and again, throughout the media. That doesn't mean everybody agrees on exactly the details of that, but it does mean that there is a certain consensus that I think is a very strong one. And many other proposals that come up that some people might be concerned about will go through a process of a legislature that will either put them aside or amend them or change them, a court system that can review them and rule out of bounds the ones that cross certain principles. And I think, again, we have great confidence in Israelis' democracy and their ability to work out these problems without our input. I've never been concerned about being Jewish. I like being Jewish. My Jewish background is a big part of why I'm doing what I'm doing. I came here first actually with my family in 1973 when my parents were on sabbatical, and we were here when the Yom Kippur War occurred and stayed through the war. I returned after high school to live with an Israeli family and study. I returned again for a year of college at Hebrew University, and then professionally have made the U.S.-Israel relationship, Israel's security, and Israel's search for peace with its neighbors really the central focus of my work. All of that, I'm sure, comes out of my own background and my own experiences and affinity for Israel and desire to see it have the best possible future and the best possible relationship with the United States. I speak Hebrew, as you heard. I've always found all of those elements to be useful in helping me understand this region and helping me understand Israelis and their fears and hopes and dreams in this society. I've never considered it to be a barrier to working in other parts of the Middle East, and I've traveled throughout the Middle East and the Arab world. I haven't made it to Iran, but that's for particular reasons. There's still time. But throughout the Arab world, I've traveled widely. I have always been open and honest about my Jewish background, and I don't think it's ever been a barrier to my representing my country and doing good, effective work on its behalf. I think in a different era, it would have been unusual to have an American Jew appointed as ambassador to Israel. There may have been in some earlier time questions about dual loyalties or whether it was an appropriate appointment. I think that era is history. It's behind us. I'm the third Jewish American to serve as ambassador, and I guess 3 of the last 5 have been. The fact that I have had experience here, the fact that I speak Hebrew, were generally considered to be positive attributes that would help me be an effective communicator with the Israeli people and an effective analyst of Israeli policies and society that I could report back to Washington. So I think it's all been a positive. I guess that's a personal experience that I'm talking about, and maybe other people will have experienced it differently, but that's how it's been for me. Well, I probably interpret those events differently than you do, and I don't think the analysis of pressure is the right way to think about it. Obviously, it's true that when the president came into office, he did put a very strong emphasis on trying to make progress in the peace talks. He appointed a high-profile special envoy, Senator Mitchell. It was just after Operation Cast Lead, and obviously the atmosphere had become much more difficult for peace talks, despite a year of relative progress following the Annapolis conference in the last year of the Bush administration. So the atmosphere was not that conducive to resuming those peace talks. And so what we set out to do was to try to improve the atmosphere, and that meant asking everybody to do things that would contribute. It meant asking Israel to make some change in its settlement policy. It meant asking Arab nations to make gestures of normalization toward Israel. It meant asking Palestinians to intensify their security cooperation and their anti-incitement work. Some things happened, but the whole package didn't quite produce the improved atmosphere that we had hoped, and I think everybody bears some responsibility for that, and everybody might do things a little differently because of the relative lack of success. In fact, of course, the Prime Minister did do an unprecedented settlement moratorium. We did see continued security cooperation really better than ever between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. We saw improvements in the economy on the West Bank, freedom of movement for Palestinians, a change in the closure of Gaza after the flotilla. And so it's not as though there haven't been some situations that have improved on the ground. What we want to see is more of that, because that can help provide what's been lacking, which is a lack of confidence between the two sides. But in terms of the President's commitment, it's the same as it always was. Of course, in May of last year, he gave a speech where he described some principles on territory and security that he thinks can be the beginnings of, can form the basis for the negotiations. We worked through the fall with the quartet to, first of all, prevent a vote on Palestinian statehood in the Security Council or the issue of coming to other UN bodies, and instead to resume negotiations. We now have resumed negotiations, which we are working with others, the Jordan and the quartet, to continue. So I think there's obviously a realistic assessment about how much progress can be made, how quickly, and what's possible. But there's really no change in the commitment to try to do so, and the commitment to try to support the parties in being the ones to make that progress. You know, it is true that we're in an election year in the United States. We're probably also in the, you know, the run-up to an election in Israel, whether it's in 2012 or 2013. And it is probably also true that that does begin to affect people's perceptions and people's behavior. I think, in fact, it affects people in the region's behavior more than it affects ours. And I think our commitment to trying to achieve progress on this will be very strong throughout this year. And if I'm standing here a year from now, I think I'd be saying very much the same things about what our policy is. We, of course, you know, are aware of this issue, and that there are a number of incidents, and some of them very high profile, about you know, hostile audiences and things toward Israeli speakers. Of course, it doesn't reflect the American policy, as you know, and as I've described. And of course, in a society of free speech, people in the United States can express their views. I think it's a minority view, very much. I think if you look at all public opinion polling in the United States across many years and continuing today, you see strong support for Israel, strong identification with Israel as an ally, as a friend and partner. That doesn't mean there aren't people who disagree with that, and some of them can be vocal, but I don't think it represents anything like a majority sentiment among Americans, and it certainly doesn't reflect our policy. I think the best antidote for it, of course, is education and dialogue, and that puts Israeli students who go to campuses and Israeli professors who go to campuses on a little bit on the hot seat, because they're the best representatives who can, through dialogue and through education, break down some of the negative stereotypes about Israel that might fuel some of those attitudes. And of course, they deserve support from the administration, which we try to do through the exchange programs we have, and from the universities themselves, most of which I think very much welcome having Israelis on their campuses. As I said, you know, if you're an American if you're an American university and you want to tap the best of the particularly the high-tech sector internationally, you want Israelis on your campus. So I think there's actually a warm environment at the level of administrations. I don't think I see any significant deterioration in support for Israel among American society, just because there are people on campuses who may move up into leadership positions and might hold those views, because, as I said, I think the broad view is quite different. But I do think, you know, it relates to my earlier point that there is the potential over 15 or 20 years for the societies to grow somewhat more distant from each other and to drift a little bit. That's not inevitable, and I think we should try to work very hard to avoid that. But it also is not automatic that we'll remain as close and as connected as we are today. It takes work, it takes education, it takes exchange, it takes government-sponsored and people-to-people sponsored initiatives to keep those connections as strong as possible into the next generation. Well, I will certainly strongly support Secretary Clinton's remarks, which, of course, what was published was not exactly what she said. It was a closed forum, but in that she made very clear that the United States will stand for the equality of women everywhere, and we do. And that's in all countries, those we are friendly with and those we're not friendly with. We, of course, are still working on that project in our own society. We are not perfect, and we still have work to do to achieve full equality for women in the United States. But it's clearly a principle that we will always speak to. You know, again, there may be those in Israel who take a different view on that. My own judgment is they represent a very small minority, and that the vast majority of this country, including really many in the Haredi community who have seen others in their community express a different view, support that principle. But again, it's in a democratic society, these are issues that we have confidence that an Israeli democracy can work through its own institutions. You know, we will always stand for those principles anywhere. Some places, I think, the problem is more acute and more troubled and needs more outside intervention than is the situation in Israel. Well, we have a law that's been on the books for many years, which, of course, we will faithfully implement, which says that if international organizations, if UN bodies, accept Palestine as a full member before the establishment of a state through negotiations, that we will not be able to support that organization. So that's U.S. law. It's been law for a long time, and we'll faithfully implement it. I think the two principles are not really in conflict because we do believe very strongly that the achievement of a Palestinian state is the United States' interest. It's something Palestinians deserve for their own rights and aspirations, and it's something Israelis need to achieve their goal of sustaining Israel as a secure Jewish democratic state. And so that's why through all the various negotiations and ups and downs of that diplomatic process, we're still trying to advance toward that goal. But we do believe the goal can only really be achieved through direct bilateral negotiations between the parties. It can't be achieved through an external, international forcing of the resolution. That's not going to. We can pass a lot of resolutions, but that won't actually create a Palestinian state. It won't provide the security arrangements that Israel will need in any two-state solution. It won't define what the borders are so that Palestinians and Israelis both feel that they have the territorial basis they need for their permanent borders. That's only going to happen when the two sides are sitting together. So rather than try and short-circuit that process by internationalizing it, we're going to try to steer right back toward the direct negotiations. But we're going to do it with a very firm conviction that we need to succeed. We shouldn't want to see 5 more years or 10 more years pass without this conflict being resolved, because it gets harder to resolve over time, not easier, because the threat of a really prolonged conflict to Israel's security and its status as a Jewish democratic state, the threat that it poses to our interests and to Palestinians ever achieving their legitimate rights is very real. And so we want to try to, with all the difficulties, but also with all deliberate effort and dispatch, try to move those negotiations forward as quickly as possible.